And the recording has started. So real briefly, this is a class that I wanted to do and some company policy discussing two things. An escalation clause. I have no idea why that rang through on my phone, my headset. An escalation clause and a finding suitable housing clause, because both of those could be used in today's market. So first, let's make sure our terminology is clear. Contingency is not just I've got to sell my home to move into another home. A contingency is anything that has to be released in order to have the contract move forward. We have contingencies on the sale of our old house. We have contingencies on financing. We have contingencies on does the house appraise. So we often, as real estate agents, we present an offer and say, by the way, this is contingent, and that's where we stop. We need to make sure our terminology is it's contingent on the sale of a home and what that specific contingency is. So in our discussion, don't forget that part. So let's start with escalation clauses. So I have one that I have in writing. It was written by an ERA agent, and it was written on the back page of the contract. And here is everything it says. 32 miscellaneous, escalation clause. I wish Brenda could listen to us now because this would be good. Escalation clause. Buyer will pay $500 over highest offer up to $239,000 if escalation clause is used. And then it also said somewhere that I had to have a blacked out version. I'm sorry, I need to go pull that up. A blacked out version of the contract. Let me bring that up. Has anybody else seen these first?
Yeah.
What other kind of escalation clause? Is that language fairly what you have heard, or have you heard something completely different? Have you seen, I'm typing at the same time. Have you seen forms used?
No.
Cheryl says she's seen them. Let me find that. I thought I had saved that entire clause, so forgive me for not being able to read it. If escalation clause is utilized, seller to provide copy of offer with blacked out name that was highest and best. Does that sound like the clauses you've seen? Let's go ahead and unmute more and have a little more conversation, please.
Okay. Can you hear?
I
haven't seen it, Greg, but
okay.
That's not a surprise.
Okay. So if that's written in the contract, just like it's written, go ahead. Who was? Somebody started to say something? No? Okay. If that's written into the contract that way, and you accept this offer, what happens next? Do you just sign it on the back and you're done? Or you do something else?
Greg, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's Cindy. Okay, I have just experienced one of these escalation clauses, and there was a lot of CYAs in that thing. And even though they offered $5,000 over a top price because there was so many contracts, it was still held to go through in the inspections. They really hit us hard on the inspections, a lot more than what the cost of the house was.
Okay.
So
well, I'm going to tell you what my philosophy. I'm going to go ahead. Okay. Yes, Cheryl, if an escalation clause is used, everything else in the contract is still functioning as in contingencies. But let me give you a little bit of my philosophy on this. To me, an escalation clause, as simply as it's written here, is very poor. and I'm going to throw out some questions, but I really think what this should be is a letter of intent rather than an escalation clause written into a contract. The way it's written into the contract right here, Brenda, are you with us now? Almost, got it. The way it's written into the contract right now, and I'll read it one more time. Buyer will pay $500 over highest offer, up to $239,000 if escalation clause is utilized. Seller to provide copy of offer with blacked out names that was highest and best. So if we agree to take this and we mark it pending in the MLS, and then another offer comes in that's higher than whatever our first escalation was agreed on, do we now get to raise the contract another $500? Interesting question, isn't it? I think there is a possibility that you could say, I have a backup offer now that was higher than yours. So your escalation clause is still in effect. It's part of the contract. Your price just went up again. How happy will the buyer be if you tell them the price just went up? Not very happy, right?
Then you're dealing with the appraisal.
What, Cindy?
I think then you're dealing with the appraisal. It keeps crawling up, and you don't know if it's going to appraise that value, and you're back to the square one.
That's correct. Now that buyer has to go back to their bank and said, oops, my price just increased. And then you say, oh my, the price just increased. Well, the lender's got to do it all. What if that price increase happens the day before closing? See, the problem here with this, the way it was written in this offer anyway, was that they put all this malarkey in that could still continue to affect the contract after it's signed by all people. The way we handled it in this particular case is we put a line through and everybody initialed all of the escalation clause and wrote a new fixed price on the front page of the contract, which protects the buyer a bit more because now we have a fixed price. We've removed this clause. Let me say another thing about this. If you take this to your seller, and I'm keep looking for notes to see if anybody's commenting. If you take this to your seller and you say, look, this person is willing to pay up to $239,000 now. You don't have to take the 236. Why don't we just take their offer and counter back 239 and remove all of that stuff? Because we've discovered the buyer is willing to pay that. Now, when you're representing the seller, that's great. But what have you done if you're representing a buyer and you put one of these clauses in? You've now said to the selling agent, here's the highest we're willing to make, and they could just strike through all this and counter back. It can become a problem if you are trying to represent a buyer and put an escalation clause in. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So how do you prevent that? How do you fix it?
You don't use escalation clauses. I don't like them. But, and I advise against
Like
them.
them either.
I'm sorry, what, Cindy?
I don't like to use them either. I think they're deceiving. They're very deceiving. It's just not right out there when everybody else is trying to be ethical when they're doing contracts.
And
it's a jump. That's so ethics.
And I agree. I have advised sellers, we have this, I'm required to present it. You're not required to consider it. You can say, nope, I don't like it because it's an escalation clause. Or you can take their highest amount and just counter straight back. How about this question? If an escalator is asking you to reveal to them the best offer, is it ethical to tell everybody else that you have an offer for the highest point of that escalation? Could you counter somebody else and say, I have an offer for, and in this case, 239. Are you willing to match it? Cheryl, I'm looking for you to tell me if that's ethical or not.
I would say it's not.
But the person that is asking for that escalation clause wants to see the highest and best. Suzanne said no. Cheryl said no.
I would word it in a different way. If you're going to negotiate with somebody else, just say we have multiple offers. So our offer to you is 239.
There is nothing preventing you from countering back with a different price. You don't have to say the source. I would probably, if I was going to do that, agree with Erica. Here is I'm countering you this because I have this many counters. Will you take it? Cheryl says there has to be a process to get to that final price. Yes, Cheryl, I agree. It's BS. So let me throw this out at you. Kansas Real Estate Commission has had a ruling that it is not illegal to have escalator clauses. I've seen that in one of their opinions back in 2016. However, just because the Real Estate Commission says that doesn't mean that it's necessarily entirely legal. There's a lot of escalator clauses in gas and oil. And back in the mid 80s, there was a lot to do with Kansas in oil, and they decided that an escalator clause with a cap was not necessarily enforceable. So the fact is, if somebody writes one, part of what you have to have in a contract is a fixed price, a date, that it's going to happen in the two parties and whatever the property is. And with an escalator clause, you don't have a fixed price. And some courts have ruled, and I found this in multiple areas, that a buyer could back out of a contract altogether because the offer was never enforceable. It had a cap. And they take it to court. So I'm going to go back to my original statement. I don't like escalator clauses. But by law, and I'm going to advise you people not to go out and write them. I don't think it's a good idea. I think you should get your clients to do the highest and best and be done with it. I think there is law issues with them. On the other hand, if you get presented one, you have to give to one of your clients, you have to present it. And if a client asks you to write an escalator clause, you just can't say no and walk away if you're an agent. So let's be sure that we can advise them the best way we can with everything. And that is, it's a really bad idea for a lot of reasons. And I'm trying to give you some of those reasons. I'll give you another one, and that would make my heart burn. What if we had the listing and we also had the buyer and there was an escalator clause? How much liability is the company or you or your, everybody going through getting that? So I'm just not a fan. I'm just not a fan. And I'm still open to discussion for anybody who would like to say anything. Do you have other thoughts about why they shouldn't be used other than what I just threw out there?
Sorry, I'm here now.
Hi, Brenda. Cheryl says, I don't want to be the agent assisting in making new laws. I like how Brenda does it. Tell the buyer to make the absolute highest price they're willing to pay, etc. Clauses will cause a lot of buyer remorse, and it will cause a buyer window to get out. I agree. I'm not sure it's necessarily legally enforceable. But let's go back to your seller side. I got a hold of Bud over at Keller Williams, and he is not aware that his company is passing around forms on how to write escalator clauses. But he was going to try to see if they were and get me a copy of one. Haven't seen it yet. I will say this. If I had a seller, Well, I hear you, Cheryl. You say if it's in writing and legal, it is enforceable. I'm telling you, the Kansas Real Estate Commission said they didn't think it was illegal. That doesn't mean a court has decided it isn't illegal. And indeed, in 85 and 75, courts found escalator clauses were illegal in gas and oil. So I'm telling you that law could be reapplied over here, and in other states, they've definitely been found to be unenforceable. So if I had a seller and I had an escalator clause, I would counter right back. Here's the at the highest price. We'll take your highest price offer and see what they say. That's definitely legal. And in my humble opinion, if you get an escalator clause and it's exercised for whatever reason, make sure you write out the original offered price on the front of the contract, write in the new price, have everybody initial and date it, and then waive the rest of the escalator clause after that with initials and dates. Any other advice on that?
I think the biggest issue when I talk to my sellers about escalation clauses and the risk with them and the things that I have seen happen, I don't write them, but I have been in multiple offers where we have lost to an escalation clause. And the thing that I see that happens the most is anytime you make any change on a contract, it's a counteroffer. It's a 100% counteroffer. So what ends up happening, and I've seen this happen 3 times now to other agents, they go with the escalation clause, which means that the seller makes a counteroffer to that buyer. And what ends up happening is the buyer hangs out with it for a couple of days. However, because it's always 3 or 4 days when I hear back from the other agent, the buyer hangs out with it for a couple of days until the initial fervor of the property dies down. The other people who have made offers, real legitimate offers, are on their way to other homes. They've already cut the ties with the one that they made the offer on. And then the buyer starts trying to negotiate down from the seller. You know, well, I need proof that you had an offer for X amount. You show them that proof and you have violated agency because you cannot share that confidential information with another person.
That's correct.
So you struggle with that. You figure out how to get through that maybe. By then, the property is now 5, 6, 7 days on the market, and it's had market weary time in our market. And then that buyer says, no, sorry, I'm not going to do it unless you take X amount. Right. And they begin negotiating again. So either the seller ends up with less than they could have when they first began, or it becomes a will of egos and the seller says, okay, screw you. I'm going to go back and see if there's anybody else that made an offer that would still be interested in purchasing. Well, and I've gotten 2 contracts accepted that way.
Well, and I'm gonna say this to you, Brenda. I read the escalation clause. It was very simply written on the back of mine. The one that I had to use as an example. Buyer will pay $500 over highest offer up to $239,000 if, if escalation clause is utilized, seller to provide copy of other offer blacked out with names that was highest and best. Period. Now, if we had signed that as presented, which we could have, we would have never had to make a counteroffer because they said in the original offer, we'll pay the best. And as I pointed out at the beginning, literally, we could have another backup offer presented the day before closing, and they would have to go up to their cap if that happened because they this should have been written as a letter of intent rather than in the part of the contract that way.
But in order, unless that buyer is paying cash.
Right. There are other contingencies. I get it.
Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. You're saying you wouldn't have had to counter.
I could have accepted it. I could have accepted that as written. And every offer we got, they would have to go up $500 up to $239.
You
because
could not have accepted that as written because in that contract, there is no sales price.
exactly, which is why it's not enforceable. So
That's,
that's my point. In order, the way it was written is a big
okay, you
problem.
just said, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but you just said you wouldn't have had to counter and you would have had a contract.
Right,
That is not,
because on the front page they wrote a price of 236,100, and then they said they would raise their offer all the way up. So I'm saying overall, this is so poorly written and it's such a bad idea. I showed it to my sellers and I said I wouldn't accept this if I were you. So what we did on this instead was we lined through all of their contingency crap and wrote the price on the front. It's a mess. It's really a mess. And I like what Cheryl wrote. She said, my sellers turned it down due to concerns about appraisal. And April said, I had a buyer that their offer was accepted. To say the other agent said, no way my offer was an escalation. He threatened to take the listing agent to the board. There is no board position on escalation clauses. So you can take care of that. I will tell you that the board is relooking at escalation clauses as well as contingency clauses because we've found another issue. I guess my bottom line still is, and where I'm telling you guys to go, please don't write these. If you do write them, be very careful. I'm not supportive of them. I think you should tell your buyers to make the highest and best. And I question some ethics problems about if you tell what the top price is that you will offer, if you're revealing things about your buyer, obviously with their position. On the seller side, I would just counter their full top price and see what happens. But let's leave that for a minute. I want to make sure we have time to talk about another issue. Something that's been used in the past, and I know Lance has done it, and I've looked up a few other things, is a contingency clause from the seller that says, I'm not going to sell my house. I'm going to accept your contract on my house, but it's contingent on me finding suitable buyers. Now suitable housing for my home. Down at the bottom, there's a little reaction thing. Can you raise your hand or give me a thumbs up if you have ever used a clause for a seller contingent on seller finding suitable housing to move into? April has. Cheryl says, I think it's okay as long as there is an agreeable time frame. I agree. Okay. Here's what I'm going to say, and like every other contingency, it is messy, and it can be done. I'm not April. I'm in the lobby, and I'm Lynn. Okay, sorry, April. It's Lynn. The things that I've read, and I've got some noise in the background. Please mute if you're. It's just like I'm not sure who that is. I hear somebody in the background. Can you please mute? Okay, and Cindy raised her hand. Sharon raised her hand. Okay, I think that took it. Suzanne was talking. So if a suitable housing contingency is written well, much like our current contingencies on I have to sell my house to buy this home, I think they can be used. I have an example of one on a sheet they have in Oregon. Lance told me he basically uses our I have a home to sell contingency and changes the names and some terminology. But I agree, you have to have a specific date is the most important. You have to have a method to release the contingency. And that means how do you notify the other side? You don't leave it going till the end of the contract. I'm going to look for homes for the next 2 weeks because they're so hard to find. And if I don't find one at the end of 2 weeks, I'll release you from your offer. That's going to be kind of it in a nutshell. You should have all of your inspection dates start on when the contingency release date starts. I'm going to see if I can share my screen real quick. Because it'll be easier if I can do this. Okay. Can you guys all see this? Oh, Tim is in the waiting room. Let's let Tim in. Show chat. Okay, Erica says she can see it. So, this is from the New Hampshire Association of Realtors. They have a form for this finding of suitable housing, and you can read it. I can tell you that one thing it has right up front is a suitable house buy contingency date. So just like when we're writing a contingent on selling my home, this says by this date, I will have my home sold, found. And if I don't have one, Mr. Buyer, you can walk away. Now, I think it's important that you have a specific date. And I think everything I read would say anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, maybe up to 4 weeks. And as hot as our market is, I think a potential buyer could at least understand what you're doing. I don't know that I would recommend you guys go out and do this on every buyer you have or every seller that you want to put a house on the listing, on the market. But I think as fast as houses are moving on the market, we could tell a seller this could potentially be something that you could use so that you could secure a buyer while you're still looking for a home. I would disclose it in the private remarks of the MLS that this would be contingent on the seller finding suitable housing. Now, this particular form, I don't like the way it was written, whereas our board on the natural form, I'm sorry, I'll get to that. On our contingent on selling a home form is less committed. So this form says if I have not found a home or if I do not release this contingency by X date, then this contingency is null and void and you get to buy my house, whether I found a house to move into or not. I'm kind of liking the board form terms, and if everybody told me, oh, come up with the form, Greg, I'm sure I could. I think the Board of Realtors just actually started on this or is going to consider this as a board. But this says, and I like some of the things they've done, I will find suitable housing by this date and then release this contingency altogether. And then the rest of the contract goes forward just like before. I would address earnest money, not to be deposited until contingency is released, or do I deposit it? Because if I don't have earnest money, the other buyer is just out looking for other houses. Should we put something in this contingency that the buyer keeps continue looking for homes? And if the buyer wants to release this contingency, how does he walk away and what happens? So there's a lot of discussion around this. And I open up anybody to talk about it if you want. But the bottom line is, if I've got a seller who wants to put his house on the market, but is scared he won't find suitable housing, can we help them? Or are we locked into they have to find the house first before they put their house on the market? Comments?
Well,
Thoughts?
I think if you put in there that the buyer can walk, and if there's more than one contract, then the listing agent's going to suggest to their seller that they accept the other offer because it's no advantage to that seller to take that offer if the buyer can walk on it.
Well, I don't disagree. And I think if you have a reasonable time frame, I think a buyer would understand that. So what do we consider a reasonable time frame? 2 weeks in this market? 3 weeks? Or is that not a good idea?
I think 3 weeks is enough time.
Would anybody ever use something like this? Or is this something you all go, man, this is bizarre. I don't want to get into that at all. Yes, Cheryl, I think it should be disclosed in the MLS. I think it would go into the private remarks for other seller agents. I haven't seen this used often, but then we've never been in a market like this before. And I think part of our job as real estate agents is if we know that people want to sell their home, but they're scared they will be homeless, how can we help them figure that out? And that is the only real use of this. Oh, I like Cheryl. Call your broker. Thanks. I think if you have a seller who's got a $150,000 house and wants to move into a $250,000 house, but they're having trouble finding one they want to move into, I think it is reasonable to use this kind of form because you're going to, or contingency, because you know they're probably going to get an offer pretty quick. The market here is so hot that if somebody really sees it and falls in love with it, they would be willing to wait 2 weeks to see if the seller found a house they wanted to move into. I don't think this is going to be an overwhelmingly used contingency, but I think it's another tool to put in your toolbox. And the considerations I would probably make is to get our current contingent on selling a house form, change things from buyer to seller, and change things to finding a suitable home and using the appropriate dates. I don't know that I would write this into paragraph 32 because that's going to be a lot of writing. I would use a standard addendum form. But I guess the real need will come from how many sellers you guys are talking to that won't put their house on the market because they can't find a home to move into. And if you guys report back to me that this is something you really need, then we'll work on having a standard form that we create. Does that make sense? Okay, then. Are there any other comments that people would like to make before I stop recording? Boy, you guys are a silent bunch. Thanks. Okay, then I'm going to click stop recording.